One. This is a new type of event that we're having today. It's part of a series of events surrounding The Yellow Wife by Sadeqa Johnson. I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of background as to how it came about. Sadeqa Johnson's inspiration for The Yellow Wife came from her family walking along the slave trail in Richmond, and she was drawn to, and in her words, her psyche kept calling her back to the trail marker of Mary Lumpkins, which is the wife of the owner of the Lumpkins jail. So in talking with her and hearing her inspiration, I thought it might be something new and novel to lay the groundwork for the setting by doing a virtual walk along the slave trail. So if you're part of our discussion group, there are daily posts that pull from this actual walk. In my research for this, that's how I came upon Anna Edwards in researching the Lumpkins jail and the slave trail. People said the person that you have to speak with is Anna Edwards. So that's how I came to Anna Edwards. I would like to now introduce her. Anna is a very, very busy woman, because when I was trying to get in touch with her, her name popped up all over the place. I would say that among her titles is a public historian, an author, or an artist. She also works with the American Civil War Museum. She is a member of the Virginia Friends of Mali. And as I had mentioned, my research in surrounding the Yellow Wife pulled me to the Shako Bottom Alliance, which is part of one of the roles that Anna also holds. She does work with the Defenders of the Sacred Ground Project, and she is, are you the founder, Anna, of the Sacred Ground Project?
Yeah.
Okay, so as you can see, we are very fortunate and lucky to have Anna here today. Thank you, Anna. And I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Well, thanks. You know, I will say that one of the reasons I sound so busy, yes, I am busy, but it's interesting how, and I'm sure all of you have been through these experiences where you join something, you participate in something, and it never quite lets you go. And then people keep it on the list. And so you sound like you're doing 40 things all at the same time, all at once. I'm starting to feel a little ADD, you know, it's like whatever jumps up in front of me is the thing I'm doing. So I'm really happy to be doing this because I think I like talking to people almost more than anything else. To sort of put a kind of hopefully comprehensive frame around you know, this work, I started in as the chair of the Sacred Ground Project, which was itself a project of a social justice organization that began back in 2002. And in 2004, we had an event where we pulled together a symposium, and this was after a year-long campaign to establish a historic highway marker overlooking the site of where the burial ground once was, which coincidentally behind us overlooked the site of the Robert Lumpkins slave trading complex. From that point on, we essentially decided that because the burial ground site itself was completely invisible, there was no way to know that it had ever been there. And because the story of Gabriel's Rebellion, which was a really critical, what some people would describe as a non-event, but in fact it was quite the event, including the loss of life that accompanied it, had a tremendous political effect on Black life and also the political life of the brand new Richmond, Virginia, the brand new Virginia as one of the leading founding states of the nation. So we were basically trying to show to Richmond itself, it was actually much easier to show the world, that Black life had played a critically important role in the makings of the country, and that these were some of the incidents and these places in Shako Bottom, because it was the founding of the city, or the founding location of the city, were places that we could know, that we put our feet on. You could touch the walls of buildings whose footings were on the original footprint of the layout of the city, the original 4x8 city blocks that were laid out in 1737 by a surveyor named Mayo for a man named Byrd, who owned all of the property along the river for quite a few miles, actually. Anyway, there's lots of weeds we could get into if we started down that path. But just to say that this is a really compelling location in the modern day city of Richmond. And over the last 15, to 20 years, we have all seen how our society has begun to shift in terms of what it's willing to understand about its past. We went through some horrific periods, and as we have worked to either recover from them or push through them or push past them, many things were either intentionally or maybe even for self-preservation's sake, kind of disappeared. Like, we don't need to talk about that anymore. We're trying to get past it. We're trying to move forward. And of course, the problem with that kind of thinking, if it goes on for too long and in too many ways, is that we tend to forget why things happen and how they happen. And when those patterns begin to repeat, we don't recognize the signs. So in this period, and in particular after this summer, which has really just been a gigantic, exclamation point over events from 3 years ago and 4 years ago, when the killings of the church members in Charleston, South Carolina took place and everything blew up. And then before that, there was a period when everything blew up. So we're getting these reminders that it's not a good idea to keep the lid on stuff. It just doesn't work. And it doesn't work across the board, right? So our work was really kind of, we didn't know that we were contributing to that per se, because you don't know what's coming. But we did know that we were doing something important. And part of the reason we knew that was because we got positive responses every step of the way, except in officialdom, right? So in the electoral arena, the people who are elected to office are really the most trepidatious about accepting big shifts or indications of things that might press on the status quo. Okay, so 20 years later, a lot has been accomplished, and it's not just us. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that we were people who amplified what was already being talked about, but was not being talked about in an arena where people were making the connections. So in Richmond, we started a newspaper, we started a radio show, and both of those were vehicles for ongoing community communication. And that was extremely helpful. The newspaper continues to this day, and it's called the Virginia Defender. It was originally called the Richmond Defender, and it tackled not only this particular historic project as a way to give people an update on our work to reclaim the burial ground, to begin to work to prevent a baseball stadium luxury condominium development from being planted in this area. And then at this point, we're now working on proactively on a plan for a memorial park in the city, in that area. But the newspaper also took on local social justice issues. So just for a second, I'm going to apologize because it looks like my internet connection may go in and out. So I will keep talking, but if I have to repeat something, let me know. So the newspaper took on social justice issues, and also we had a real desire as a particular group to help people understand the connection between present day events and the historical past, but also the geographical connections, right? So helping us understand what's happening here in Richmond in relation to what might be happening in Mali, for example, or in South Africa, or in France, or in Scotland, right? So we have all these historic connections. The United States, of course, wouldn't exist without having been part of the age of exploration. So not only the slave trade, but also immigration and the evolution of this country as it's trying to sort itself out as a multi-ethnic, multinational, multiracial place, is always going to have these connections to other places. And sometimes it actually matters that we understand what's going on in those places. So we're kind of all about clearing the fog, right? That's what we like to do, is just clear the fog from things. But it also meant that here in Richmond, the practical work was around elevating this history. And as the area began to be challenged by these big development projects, we had to end up focusing on how do we protect this landscape that we've really only just discovered and that we think needs to be a priority in the making of Richmond going forward. So that actually, I'm going to shortcut everything else and say that's the reason that the Sacred Ground Project is now a part of the Mayor's Shockoe Alliance. And the Shockoe Alliance is a group of Shockoe Bottom stakeholders, if you like that word, who have the ability to weigh in on what they want to see happen in Shockoe Bottom as the city prepares its 20-year strategic development plan. So this is the boring technical work of how zoning impacts cultural resources and historic preservation, and the sort of socially equitable city that we would like to see evolve in Richmond. So that is sort of, I hope that sort of gives you a sense of the work part of it. The thing that got me excited about Shockoe Bottom to begin with was learning the story of Gabriel's Rebellion. And so I'm not sure how much of the footprint of the slave trail that you guys have kind of engaged in your virtual tour, but it's a fascinating thing to do in person if you all ever get the chance to do it, in part because, especially if you have a guide who can take you through it, sort of the most dramatic way to do it would be to come here in June, after COVID has had its way with us and its various strains, and do it on during the weekend of June 19th, because we have a local cultural organization called the Alegba Folklore Society, and they do it's basically a theatrical, it's not exactly reenactments, but there are cultural performances at stops all along the way of this trail. And you do have to prepare, because what normally takes you about 2.5 hours to walk becomes really a 4 to 5 hour event that you are participating in. And so it's really quite immersive. But people come away from it completely altered in relation to what the history of the slave trade means really to all of us. We will talk about what that means to Black people, right? I mean, it seems obvious in many ways what that can mean to Black people, having come through all of that and coming through Jim Crow and coming through the 20th century and the civil rights and coming to this moment and still having to fix many things. But we don't often think about what it meant for white people as well. And the fact that to be enculturated to that kind of society makes you think certain ways, and that people have had to wrestle with that all along the way either. And so within that is the idea that we are not polar, we're not, what am I trying to say? It's not simple. None of it is ever simple on the one hand. Slavery is bad and we ended it, and racism is bad and we are working on ending it. But it was never always Black people versus all racists and white people versus, Black people. There have always been moments and powerful moments when whites and Blacks have tried to work together to end these institutions and to work on these problems. And since a lot of people really were just trying to make society work better and as a whole, you have found these places where people have worked together to make public education a thing. That was not an automatic, that was not a given in our society. And we have had a socially hierarchical society And so coming to the notion that everyone who is a citizen is entitled to all of the benefits of, of the nation as a citizen is actually fairly recent, to actually, and defining citizen and defining, who's entitled, all of these things are still in many ways debated in our society. So we are certainly a work in progress in that way. And I think I say all of that because it's in me as I think about what we are trying to do and the moment that we're in. So obviously the election, the pandemic, the election, and all of what's going on right now play a part in how I think about, and I know how we all think about our history and what it means to us in this moment. The history of Shockoe Bottom is fascinating, just because it starts off as a little teeny tiny warehouse on the falls of the river, where tobacco plantations and wheat plantations can sell their goods to the broader world. So they come from the western part of the state and the south, and they come to Richmond and stack their stuff in this warehouse. They pay Mr. Bird a fee for that, and this is how he begins to build his wealth. And he gets he has the sole right to have a warehouse that is used in this way by order of the King of England. So it's a relationship with England that is economically and politically extremely important. Richmond doesn't become an important city, though, really until the Revolutionary War, when for reasons of geographical military advantage, they decide that the city of Williamsburg is too vulnerable to attack during the war, and they decide to shift the capital and the political center to Richmond. They thought that would sort of help protect it from attack. In fact, Benedict Arnold and his troop were quite successful in making their way right on up the peninsula and right into Richmond and burned through it. But fortunately, they hadn't built anything yet, and they were able to defend the city. And so the English were not successful in that moment. After the war, the city develops incredibly rapidly because it is now the capital of the state. But in many ways, except for what's going on up in New England, in terms of the South, the Southern colonies, Virginia is now really critically important political state. So the capital is under construction very quickly. They begin to plan the, sorry, there's other work going on in this place. So they begin to plan the construction of the Capitol building, the construction of a canal that would connect the western and eastern sides of the James River to itself, so that they can move goods from the west out to the east, which means to the Atlantic and out into the world. And at the same time, they, let's see, there were three big projects. Oh, the state prison, the very first state prison was under construction at that same moment. So if you've got three enormous municipal projects underway, you need labor. And that labor is coming in from everywhere. And that's skilled white laborers in the trades, but it's also unskilled free Black labor. And it's also hired or leased slave labor, right? And so that means that plantations and people who are simply dealing in enslaved people are leasing them to these construction projects, and they are making their money that way, and these construction projects are being built. But it means that the city of Richmond, which is really, like I said, a blip, a village, it starts off with somewhere around 800 people before the war. After the war, we're at about 1,100, 1,500 people when it really is starting as the capital. And by 1800, about 15 years later, it's got about almost a little over 5,700 people. And then it just keeps growing. By the time we get to the Civil War, there's more than 30,000 people in the city of Richmond, which is big for the day and certainly big for the South. up in New England, New York, and Philadelphia have long passed that. They're big cities, right? But in the South, we don't have big cities like that. And because Richmond is an important political center, it also, because of the projects that I describe, in particular the canal, becomes a really critical shipping center. It's a place where from the north they can come to Richmond, and then things can be distributed out from there. So it's self-important. It is important, and it's growing. And so all of these things really matter. The other thing that's happening around the Revolutionary War is the difference in how slavery is conducted in the country. So one of the things that happens is that in the 1720s, a law was passed. So this is during the colonial period. A law was passed that slave owners actually did not have the right to manumit any enslaved person unless they got the permission of the colonial government. So this is probably something that slaveholders are seeing as a real choke on their authority or their autonomy. So after the colonies win their independence from England, one of the things that Thomas Jefferson authors is a bill to change that law. And in 1782, they made it legal for individual slave owners to manumit enslaved people basically at will. It simply meant they didn't have to ask permission of the state, and they could do it by deed, by will, and they could do it themselves. They could simply, sell somebody and sell them for the purpose of manumission, which usually meant an arrangement with that individual. And you would see quite a bit of that. But in a very particular period, because of the change of that law in 1782, between that period and between 1782 and 1790, which was the census, the first census, somewhere in the order of 12,000, the free Black population grew from around 300 and something to around 12,000 in the state of Virginia. So this is that's quite a mass of suddenly free Black people. The problem is that the state of Virginia and the society as it was being crafted had no intention of being a society where free Black people could rise to equal citizen status. So even though they were free, they were not citizens. And their role in the United States had been to serve as the labor force or a labor force for this society. And so they were seen as now sort of netherworld beings who aspired to some kind of citizenship and equity, and yet were really not socially going to be seen that way by people. They were seen as only technically not enslaved. And so there was a real struggle. Now, as I describe laws and customs in a sort of formal way, you do understand that on the ground, people behave in all kinds of ways. So you are going to have individuals who are going to find a way to make the most of their situation and rise economically, right? Own properties and businesses and those things that are legal for them to attain. And on the other hand, the vast majority of people are really going to be poor laborers. And for most whites at this time, the vast majority of the population are poor laborers as well. So there's a little bit more of an interesting kind of parity in that regard, where we begin to look back and see these opportunities for solidarity that we wish could have been cultivated if people could have gotten past their racial problems, right? But also recognizing that the officialdom recognized that those kinds of solidarities were certainly possible, because again, we're still dealing with a very socially hierarchical society. You've got upper class, you've got lower class, you've got nobles and aristocrats, whether they want to acknowledge that's what they call them or not. You have good people and you have poor people, bad people, those who are, and and literally equating poverty with immorality. And this is something that does not quit until deep into the 20th century. And in fact, we really kind of still deal with that today, right? So again, this is, I hope I'm conveying a sense of not a simple society, a very complex society where much of what we are wrestling with today has its origins in a time when these things were much more open. You know, people weren't afraid to say, you know, I don't like that person because they're Black, and or I don't like that person because they're Irish, or I don't, you know, there are ways in which those kinds of tendencies, much more open at that time, have made their way into our society and represent themselves differently now, but you know, were born back then. So I'm going a little deeper than I meant to in some of this, but I still think it's good context for understanding the story of Lumpkin's jail, which is really what I should get to at this point. So I'm going to jump forward and say the shift in 1808 is the end of the transatlantic slave trade. We are no longer going to import Black people from Africa for enslavement. We are going to rely on the population that we have in this country already. And by virtue of natural increase, we have plenty that we can now begin to sell to the Deep South, because the other thing that happens is the cotton gin has been perfected. The Haitian Revolution has been successful, and France has sold the entire Louisiana territory to the country, and it's all opened up for expansion. And of course, the other thing to keep in mind is that the federal government has had the idea of continental conquest in mind from the beginning, from the absolute beginning. So as those things begin to play out, we begin to see them have a role in all these other issues. So no more importing. We're now going to sell within. So it's the domestic slave trade, and the railroads are beginning to develop. And Richmond has, again, as I said, been growing and become a very important industrial city in the South. And so Richmond, by virtue of all of these characteristics, becomes a major hub for the distribution of enslaved people to the Deep South. Robert Lumpkin comes along as that is evolving in Richmond, and sets up shop initially in the 1830s, but in various locations. And in the early 1840s, he buys the property that he develops and expands, and is known, we call it Lumpkin's Jail. It was not simply a jail, it was a slave trading complex. It was one of the big ones, but it wasn't the only big one. The main reason Lumpkin is getting all of this attention is because we've excavated his site. And it had a particular relationship to the evolution of a Black university, as well as its reputation as not just a slave trading complex, but come and bring those enslaved people that were giving them trouble so that they could be punished or tortured into compliance. The story that would be relevant for people who might know it, in particular in Boston, is the story of Anthony Burns. And I'm not going to go into it, you just have to look it up, but it's an incredible story because it involves Richmond, Boston, the Fugitive Slave Act, and many of the arguments that lead to the Civil War itself. So Robert Lumpkin is notorious for the scale of his operation and the cruelty to which people are subjected in his place. We get that, and then we find out he's got a Black wife. Well, okay, that's also a shortcut. Mary Lumpkin was an enslaved woman that he, as far as we know, he purchased as a teenage girl and took her on as his concubine and had 5 children with her. And when the war was over, found a way to legally marry her, because it certainly wasn't possible before the war. But it was also a common practice. Apparently, many of these slave traders had Black wives, and some of them kept them right there in Richmond, and some of them kept them in places where they knew that their children, or they hoped that the children of these relationships would be safe, such as Philadelphia, Massachusetts, New York, places like that. Philadelphia in particular, because it had an enormous, much bigger by proportion free Black population than many cities, and it was a politically as powerful as it could be. It was a very strong city. So if you were going to be free, that was a good place to go to get out of the South before heading somewhere else or trying to set up your life at that point. So Robert Lumpkin, like many people, his family was in Richmond, but he did send his daughters to be educated in Philadelphia. And he died within a year of the war ending. He was certainly much older than Mary Lumpkin, but because he had married her, or at least legally found a way to make her the legal heir to his property, she did inherit it. And she couldn't certainly continue in business in any kind of way, but she did ultimately lease the property to a man named the Reverend Nathaniel Culver to start a school for freed Black adults, to begin to get them an education so that they could begin to utilize their, getting an education was sort of the all, right? The be all and end all, mostly because it was fundamentally denied to them while enslaved. So once slavery ends, people want an education. The education industry really explodes through various mechanisms. But this school that he starts by leasing these buildings for a couple of years gradually evolves to become Virginia Union University. And Virginia Union University, of course, was a key college in Richmond for many of our present day Black legislators and professionals, as well as religious leaders in the city, because it is a seminary oriented school. So it has a lot of meaning to the Black community in Richmond, and therefore Lumpkin's jail site has a lot of meaning for them. It was referred to as the Devil's Half Acre during its time, and later, as it became a center of education and a liberated zone, it was referred to as God's Little Acre, right? So you can see why people would really vest themselves in developing this site as the center of a museum and as a part of a memorial site in the city of Richmond. So I'm going to stop there in terms of yakking at you and take your questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Anna. That great context to the setting for the Yellow Wife. I hope if you would like to speak directly with Anna, we can try just coming off mute and seeing if we can take turns. So if you have a question or a comment, maybe say hello, and we can see if that kind of dialogue works. To get us started, I have a couple of questions. So maybe while we're chatting about this, give some thought to some questions that you'd like or comments for Anna. Is there a particular aspect of the book of the Yellow Wife that you would want readers to pay attention to?
There were a couple of things that were interesting to me. One is the way that she combined the story of Anthony Burns with the story of Mary Lumpkin in the character of Essex. So Essex, who is, her lover from being on the Bell Plantation, is someone that she helps escape, but ends up captured and basically held in torturous conditions and then ultimately prepared for sale. And so that combining of figuring out a way to combine those two stories and develop a relationship between two people who, as far as we know, didn't really know each other very well, and that she had communicated with him. Mary Lumpkin was referenced by Anthony Burns as someone who showed him mercy, brought him a Bible, and occasionally would bring him food. But we don't know that there was any other relationship between them. So I thought that was a really interesting device in the book. The other thing that she does is point out she doesn't, it's interesting. I felt like she doesn't make this sort of the central point of the story, but one of the things that becomes really clear is that slavery at Lumpkin's jail involved a significant amount of sex trafficking, right? That was a key thread in his revenue, was the processing of young girls for sexual purposes. The term that was common in the trade at the time, and you'll see it in newspaper articles at the time, was fancy girl. And that tended, if you saw someone who was being put on the market as a fancy girl, the characteristics were often that they were mixed race, lighter skinned Black women who were considered, just what the fellas wanted. And that is something that permeates the slave trade really from the beginning and right on through its end. And since sex trafficking is a problem right on to this day, it's an interesting thread to have in there, and how the character of Mary Lumpkin reconciles herself to being the person who actually literally personally prepares these girls for that market, right? And the author has Mary treated as a very pragmatic self-preservation and preservation for these girls. She's like, this is what you're in for. Just know it, and these are the things that you can do to look after yourself, but there's not a lot you're going to be able to do about this. It's really awful. It was really one of the sort of understated, horrific aspects of this story.
All right, I'm gonna pause here for a second. Anybody want to come off mute?
Oh, and I'll let you know, if you don't know, you can come off mute simply by hitting your space bar. So if you hold your space bar down, you talk, and then you let it go, and you're muted again. It's much easier.
I just learned something new. Thank you, Anna.
Zoom verse.
Are there descendants that you're aware of Mary and Robert Lumpkin? Their kids went up north. Are there descendants?
I believe there are descendants. The family went in different directions. Oh gosh, some of this is new information for me. Mary Lumpkin, I think, ended up in Ohio, in a town that was known for being a target for Black migration after the Civil War. And so I understand that she was in New Orleans for a minute, but one of her daughters moved to New Orleans. Others decided to pass now, if it was New York City or if it was Philadelphia. And so those who decided to pass for white, because Mary Lumpkin herself was mixed race, so she was already sort of maybe my complexion. And so at least 2 or 3 of her daughters were so fair that you couldn't tell that they were Black at all, and so they decided to pass. Another one didn't so much decide to pass, but I think she was the one that went to New Orleans, and I'm not sure if she had children. So I don't know specifically, but I think most of the descendants are probably from those families that that were created up in New England. Yeah. Now there are still Lumpkins in Virginia. There are Lumpkins around. Probably distant relations, but it's a name in Virginia still.
Where do things stand with the museum at this point?
So there's an organization called the Slave Trail Commission, which is an official body of the city, which was started back in the 1990s. And their particular role has been the development of the slave trail itself. So the historic signage that you see and improvements that make it walkable. And they decide, they're also responsible for the reconciliation statue that you may have talked about in one of your blog posts that has, it's a triangular park that has a statue in the middle and a fountain. And then they were responsible for the funding that resulted in the excavation of the Lumpkins jail site itself. And that was a venture in which they thought they would only find maybe artifacts related to a slave jail. It was interesting how very narrowly focused the initial inquiry was. And in fact, they didn't find things that they thought they would find, like shackles and, you know, bits of chain or whatever, you know, sort of things we thought about. What they found were the footings of all of the buildings of the complex. And they found a retaining wall. They found everything that could tell them what this site originally looked like. And it also helped them understand what the topography was for that area at that time as well. But it gave them a complete site. And so covering it back up and saving the site for future development was the seed for the idea for developing a museum that could in some way show off that site. And then also be, for some, they wanted to establish a national slavery museum. In the meantime, though, the National Museum of African American History and Culture was built in Washington, D.C., and Charleston is in the process of building a $72 million International Institute for Slavery. I think I may not have the name quite right, but it's a major project that has been underway for 30 years, which is focused on the international trade. So the museum idea here is still kind of in flux in terms of what all it will encompass, but they are moving forward with the development of the idea for a museum. And there is at least one concept out there, but it's an initial concept. So don't look for that building to be constructed. Just know that it encapsulates many of the ideas that they are thinking about for the development of that museum. And then around that is the work that we have been doing, which was a little bit of frustration that they were focusing only on Lumpkins Jail as the critical site for this area of Shockoe Bottom, and our desire to ensure that the footprint that included the burial ground, which was north of Lumpkins Jail site, and some piece of the area adjacent to the adjacent to the Lumpkins jail site, but on the east side of the railroad tracks, where we know there's evidence of slave trading operations. But also because these are the only parcels left that have the ability to tell these stories. Everything else has been developed around it. So we're like, stop right here. We need to preserve these parcels for the purposes of interpreting this history in this moment, because Richmond has to have a way to physically acknowledge this part of its history. Now, we're also not crazy people. We know about development. We know about tax bases. We know about revenue that's needed for the city and things like that. But this area is also in a floodplain. And so there's an awful lot of amelioration that the city would have to do in terms of infrastructure in order to make this property work for standard development. So part of our proposal is that treating this area as a park site, a historic preservation site, means that we can use other resources to develop it in a smarter way in terms of the environment, while also protecting and making it available for ongoing learning around the African and African American history of Richmond. So, so we're winning that argument. It's taken a while, but it's really exciting. It's tricky because once your project, which has been sort of on the outside of officialdom, is accepted by officialdom, it suddenly becomes subject to their rules and ways of doing things. So our participation in the Mayor's Shockoe Alliance, which again was that group developing this master plan for how to develop this area, is kind of a double-edged sword. So we are always very careful, and we are very public in our response to whatever it does. So because they know that we have a newspaper, because often we don't get conversations with inner players. We get to conduct our conversations in public. And that's been really good because it means we help offer transparency and a certain kind of public accountability to process, which is an important part of equity, frankly.
If you're just joining us in the discussion group, there are pictures that are included or have been included of the slave trail and some of the markers that Anna is referencing, and also the conceptual idea of the museum that they're proposing. But wow, that you just gave us a whole different, a lot more information on that. I did have a question come in from somebody that I'm going to ask on their behalf. The question is, there's a privilege inherent in Felby, the fictional Mary Lumpkin, of being made to fill this role of a yellow wife due to colorism. Can you tell us more about that complicated privilege? Thank you for the question, Lila.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we're simple people. And back in the day, we because of the pressures on a racialized society, right? So being white is the pinnacle, right? So at least if you're white, you start there, and you work through your class dynamics, you work through your economic dynamics, you can marry up, you can get and I'm talking mostly 18th, 19th century, right, dynamics. You can get a patron who says, oh, I'm going to support you and give you letters of recommendation that are going to help you make your way in the world. And if you are moderately successful, you can get bank loans to allow you to buy a house or to buy property. So there are all these mechanisms that go along with that kind of thing. Becoming free Black, right? So suddenly I'm a Black person, but I'm free. So now I can legally own property. I can marry, which was not something that an enslaved person could do. And I can participate in certain kinds of institutions. Being mixed and therefore being lighter skinned, whites felt that Black people were becoming slightly more acceptable. The more that their blood could be mixed with whites meant that they could, they were maybe slightly more entitled to assert themselves in certain ways. In many awful ways, it was a strictly sort of European aesthetic thing that went to hairstyles and assimilation and dressing like and looking like and behaving like. Well, for in the free Black population, again during slavery, there's tremendous pressure to assimilate and conform. Can you still hear me?
Yeah. I just keep going.
Have I frozen, or can you still hear me? Okay. So with these kind of sort of dynamics at play broadly within the free Black society, the pressure to behave as much like a member of white society as possible was really there, and that went from behavior to aesthetics. And so the lighter skinned you were, the more acceptable you were, and the more willing someone was to put you forward for advantages. And that kind of thing becomes internalized. And if you're looking at how are my children going to fare in this world, people began to do things like say, well, I'm not going to marry anyone who's darker than me. I'm going to always make sure to marry someone lighter so my children are lighter, so that they don't have to struggle the way that I had to struggle. I will tell you anecdotally in my own family, because of how that put people in such difficult situations during slavery and within an enslaved, say, for example, within a farm, where typically speaking, the reason somebody became lighter skinned was because there was either a rape or a relationship between the owner and an enslaved woman. That person, the product of that kind of dynamic, was in a terrible position. They either were going to get advantages and therefore piss off other people because they got those advantages, or they were going to take advantage of those advantages and promote themselves in a way that they and their children would prosper, but nobody else around them would. Or somebody was always going to think that you were going to do that, right? So it's it was a terrible dynamic that was constantly being wrestled with. And so for a member of my family who was the product of that situation, he actually flipped it and said, I am going to marry the darkest woman that I can so that my children are clearly Black and nobody is confused about what side they're on, right? So as we make our way after slavery, this kind of colorism is permeating, post-war culture and free society. And because racism and Jim Crow becomes really amplifies the segregation and the inequalities as we head into the 20th century, you have a lot of people, a lot of Black people who are going to try and align themselves in this really kind of perverse way. And there will be actual societies that are created, social groups or social clubs that say, it's like, here's the brown social club and here's the beige social club, different names, of course. But you see how a Black society then is internalizing these really perverse ideas onto itself because it sees these as the only way that they are going to really climb the highest ladders of that society. And then of course, the ultimate version of that is passing, children becoming so fair with hair that is so indistinguishable that they can pass for white. And people today through DNA testing are getting a lot of surprises in their results. But it's a real problem. And I'm sorry, I'll try to, there's a couple of anecdotes that I do want to give, and so I'll keep them short. One is that when I was in college in 1978, and I was in the dorms, I came across one of my new friends sobbing in her room and she was a Black woman, girl. We were girls. We were 18. We were girls. And so she was a little browner than me, but she was clearly Black, and she was just sobbing her eyes out. And I'm like, what is wrong? And she said, I've fallen in love with a boy and he's dark and my grandmother is not going to let me bring him home. That was 1978. 20 years later, I have my first son, and my first husband was white. My first son looks white. He doesn't look like there's any Black in him. We were at a gas station and I was filling the tank, and there was a Black woman, middle-aged, in the car next to us. And she was, how you just look around at people, and she noticed me and she noticed my son, and she wasn't fooled for a minute. She didn't think that he was a little white boy. She said, honey, Lord love him if he can pass. So in 1990s, it was still understood that to be white was better than to be Black in society. So colorism is a real issue, is a real dynamic.
Thank you, Anna. I just want to, since you were chatting, I wanted to pass on this has been a fascinating and informative session. Thank you for sharing this important work of the Sacred Ground Project with all of us today, and the work you are doing to preserve this important part of our history, a true gift. I think that is a wonderful summary. And
thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to reiterate a couple of things before you go. First of all, thank you for participating today. This is part of our first Heart and Soul book chat. We pair authors and books with a humanitarian cause. Anna was gracious enough to join us today to share the real history surrounding the setting of The Yellow Wife. And today's call and our call with Sadeqa Johnson, the author of The Yellow Wife, is on February 7th. I hope you will join us for that as well. And if you can, please consider making a small donation to the Sacred Ground Project. I say together we can make a difference. If you can cup of coffee, for the cost of a cup of coffee, make a donation. We will have, you know, I think we can help this project in a way that feels good for the mind, the body, the heart, and the soul. Finally, there is, Sadeqa Johnson was gracious enough to offer us a couple of packages to raffle off for prizes. I put it in the chat box a little later, but if you want to be included in the raffle, please add your name to the chat box or reach out to me directly at julie@juliekaminsky.com. We will do the raffle live on Friday at 1:30 because I saw this really cool thing where you can do a spinny thing and you can see how that it comes around and who will win. So please, if you're interested in that, it includes some books and some puzzles and some tea. And I want to thank Sadeqa Johnson for sharing those prizes as well. Anna, I hope you'll join us again. I can't express my gratitude for taking time to meet with us today. It makes a difference in connecting us in this bizarre world we're in right now. And I want to thank everybody for participating. And with that, oh, one more question. We have a question that we'd like to ask all our guests. What's on your reading, your to be read, or what's on your nightstand that you're reading right now? Do share if you have something that is on your nightstand or to be read. Yep. Anna might be Paul.
I have to pick one.
Leslie's reading The Yellow Wife. It's riveting, says Leslie. She has an advanced copy, a advanced reader copy. Anna, we didn't hear you, so maybe try one more time if you have a book that's on your nightstand. And if not, we will say.
I'll put it in the chat.
She's going to put it in the chat. So let's see what's on Anna's nightstand to read. As she's doing that, a reminder that The Yellow Wife is our January selection. It comes out on the 12th. And we will meet with Sadeqa Johnson on February 7th. And we hope to see you again there. I haven't, has it come up yet? We've got some coming up.
I think I was first.
Oh, you were first? Okay. Sorry. Oh, so The Organ Thieves by Chip Jones. Nice. All right, everyone. We will end here. And once again, thank you. Have a great day. Have a good week. Happy New Year. Hopefully 2021 brings everybody a few more cupcake moments of things to be grateful and happy about. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye.
All right.